Welcome to my channel. Sit back, close your eyes, and start listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. For more than 2,000 years, one question has followed her name like a shadow. Was she truly beautiful? Poets wrote of her allure, playwrights built entire tragedies around her charm, and centuries of painters imagined her as the most desirable woman who ever lived. And yet the coins struck during her own lifetime, the objects closest to how she actually wished to be seen, show a woman with a strong, angular profile and a prominent nose, nothing like the soft, idealized beauty later ages assumed she must have possessed. So if it was not simply her face that conquered two of the most powerful men in Rome, what was it? This is the story of Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh of Egypt, a ruler who spoke perhaps 9 languages, governed a kingdom balanced on the edge of collapse, and used intellect, strategy, and sheer force of will hold her place in a world built to destroy women who reached for power. Her legend has survived for 2,000 years. It is time to look past the legend and toward the historical woman underneath it. Chapter 1: A Dynasty Built on Blood. Cleopatra was not Egyptian by ancestry, a fact that surprises many people encountering her story for the first time. She was born in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek-speaking rulers descended from Ptolemy I, a general who had served under Alexander the Great, and who, after Alexander's death, claimed Egypt as his own share of the shattered empire. For nearly 3 centuries before Cleopatra's birth, the Ptolemies had ruled Egypt from the magnificent city of Alexandria, a city they themselves had built into one of the greatest centers of learning and culture in the ancient world, home to the famous Library of Alexandria and a lighthouse, counted among the wonders of the ancient world. Despite ruling Egypt for generations, most Ptolemaic monarchs never bothered to learn the Egyptian language at all, governing instead in Greek, surrounded by a Greek-speaking court, while the native Egyptian population lived largely under a separate cultural world beneath them. The Ptolemaic family had a well-earned reputation for violence within its own ranks. Power in this dynasty did not pass smoothly from parent to child in a simple, peaceful line. Instead, Ptolemaic history is filled with brothers murdering brothers, mothers plotting against sons, and siblings marrying one another specifically to keep power concentrated within the family and to eliminate the threat of outside rivals. This practice of sibling marriage, startling to modern sensibilities, followed an older tradition borrowed from Egyptian royal custom, where the pharaoh was considered semi-divine, and marrying within the family was thought to preserve that sacred bloodline. Cleopatra herself would later marry 2 of her own younger brothers in turn, unions that were political arrangements dictated by dynastic tradition rather than personal relationships in any ordinary sense. Cleopatra's own father, Ptolemy XII, ruled a kingdom that was already deeply unstable by the time of her birth. Egypt's wealth, built on the extraordinary fertility of the Nile River Valley, made it one of the richest prizes in the entire Mediterranean world, and this wealth attracted the increasingly hungry attention of Rome, then rapidly expanding and swallowing kingdom after kingdom around the Mediterranean Sea. Ptolemy XII spent enormous sums of Egyptian treasury money bribing Roman officials simply to keep his throne secure, a strategy that drained the kingdom's resources and made him deeply unpopular among his own subjects, who saw their king essentially paying tribute to a foreign power in order to remain in power himself. Into this tense, unstable, and dangerous household Cleopatra was born, one of at least 6 children, and almost certainly given an exceptional education befitting a princess of the Ptolemaic court. Ancient sources describe her as remarkably well-educated, fluent not only in Greek and Egyptian, but reportedly in numerous other languages as well, including Hebrew, Aramaic, and various regional dialects encountered by Egyptian trade and diplomacy, an unusual and valuable skill that allowed her, unlike her predecessors, to speak directly with foreign representatives without relying on translators. From childhood, she would have absorbed the political lessons of a court defined by betrayal, ambition, and constant maneuvering for survival, lessons that would serve her later in life far more than any myth about her physical appearance could. Chapter 2: A Kingdom on the Edge. By the time Cleopatra reached adolescence, Egypt's political situation had grown even more precarious. In 58 BCE, when Cleopatra was roughly 11 years old, the people of Alexandria rose up against her father, forcing Ptolemy XII to flee the kingdom entirely and travel to Rome, where he sought military support to reclaim his throne. During his absence, his eldest daughter, Berenice IV, Cleopatra's own sister, assumed power in Egypt, ruling in her father's place. Ptolemy XII eventually succeeded in his goal, returning to Egypt in 55 BCE with the backing of a Roman military force, retaking his throne, and executing Berenice for daring to rule in his absence. This event alone reveals a crucial truth about the world into which Cleopatra was growing up. Within the Ptolemaic family, the line between political rival and family member barely existed at all, and the punishment for reaching too far toward power was frequently death, even when the person reaching was your own child. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, the throne passed jointly to his 18-year-old daughter Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, who, following Ptolemaic tradition, were married to one another to legitimize their joint rule, though this marriage was a political formality rather than a genuine partnership of any personal kind. From the very beginning, this arrangement was unstable. Cleopatra, older, better educated, and evidently far more capable than her young brother, quickly began ruling in a manner that sidelined him, issuing decrees and appearing on official documents in ways that suggested she considered herself the primary ruler of Egypt rather than an equal co-monarch. This did not sit well with the powerful court officials who surrounded the young Ptolemy XIII, men who had their own ambitions for controlling Egypt through a pliable child king rather than through his far more independent-minded sister. By 48 BCE, this tension had escalated into open conflict. Cleopatra was forced out of Alexandria entirely, fleeing to the region of Syria, where she began raising an army with the intention of returning to reclaim what she considered rightfully hers. Egypt, in other words, stood on the brink of civil war between a brother and sister who had technically been married to one another only a few years before. It was at precisely this critical, unstable moment that a Roman general, fleeing his own civil war back in Rome, arrived on Egyptian shores in pursuit of his rival. His name was Julius Caesar, and his arrival in Alexandria would change the course of Cleopatra's life, and indeed the future of the entire Mediterranean world, forever. Chapter 3: Cleopatra Claims the Throne. Julius Caesar did not arrive in Alexandria by choice, but in pursuit of his defeated rival, Pompey the Great. Rome, by this point, had been consumed by civil war for years, a struggle for supremacy between Caesar and Pompey that had already torn the Roman Republic apart. Pompey, freshly defeated at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece, fled to Egypt, hoping for shelter and support from the Ptolemaic court, a court his own family had helped install years earlier. Instead, the advisors surrounding the young Ptolemy XIII, eager to win favor with the clearly ascendant Caesar, had Pompey murdered the moment he stepped onto Egyptian soil, believing this act of betrayal would please the arriving Roman general. When Caesar landed in Alexandria days later, and was presented with Pompey's severed head as a gift, ancient sources describe his reaction not as satisfaction, but as genuine horror and disgust, and Caesar reportedly wept at the sight, a response the Egyptian court had entirely failed to anticipate. Caesar's arrival placed him directly in the middle of the ongoing conflict between Cleopatra and her brother. As the most powerful Roman in the region, and given Rome's long-standing relationship with the Ptolemaic dynasty, Caesar took it upon himself to act as arbiter of the Egyptian succession dispute, summoning both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII to present their claims to the throne before him. This posed an obvious and dangerous problem for Cleopatra, who remained exiled from Alexandria and whose brother's forces controlled the city, making any direct approach to the palace extremely risky for her personally. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, writing more than a century after these events, Cleopatra solved this problem through a bold and carefully staged act of political theater. She arranged to be smuggled into the palace under cover of darkness, reportedly concealed within a bag or bundle of bedding, carried past her brother's guards by a loyal servant, and delivered directly into Caesar's private chambers. Whether every detail of this story is precisely accurate remains debated among historians, since Plutarch was writing generations after the fact and clearly shaping the story for dramatic effect. But the underlying reality it reflects is almost certainly true. Cleopatra found a way to reach Caesar directly, bypassing her brother's control entirely, and to present her case in person, using her intelligence, her command of language, and her evident political skill to make an immediate and powerful impression. Whatever combination of factors ultimately persuaded him, Caesar sided decisively with Cleopatra. Ptolemy XIII's advisors, recognizing that their control over the young king was now threatened, mobilized their forces against Caesar's relatively small garrison in Alexandria, triggering a brief but intense conflict now known as the Alexandrian War. Fighting spread through the city itself, and during this chaos, a fire broke out that reportedly damaged portions of the famous Library of Alexandria, though the precise extent of that damage, and whether the library's core collection was destroyed at this time or survived to be lost later, remains a subject of ongoing historical debate. Reinforcements eventually arrived to support Caesar, the conflict turned decisively in his favor, and Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile, while attempting to escape the fighting, leaving Cleopatra as the clear and uncontested ruler of Egypt, now formally married, in the traditional Ptolemaic fashion, to her only remaining younger brother, an even younger child named Ptolemy XIV, though actual power rested entirely with her. Chapter 4: Caesar arrives in Alexandria. With the fighting over and her position as ruler secured, Cleopatra did not simply thank Caesar and send him on his way. Instead, according to multiple ancient sources, the two began a personal and political relationship that would continue for several years and would produce a son. Caesar remained in Egypt for a number of months following the end of the Alexandrian War, a decision that surprised and concerned some of his own associates back in Rome, who wondered why their general was lingering in a foreign kingdom rather than attending to the enormous political and military responsibilities still awaiting him elsewhere. Ancient accounts describe Caesar and Cleopatra taking a leisurely journey together up the Nile River, traveling by royal barge deep into Egyptian territory, an expedition that served multiple purposes at once. On one level, it allowed Caesar, a Roman famous throughout his life for intellectual curiosity, to observe firsthand the ancient monuments, temples, and civilization of Egypt, a land that had already fascinated the Greek and Roman world for centuries. On another, more practical level, this journey was almost certainly a display of power and legitimacy, allowing the newly secured queen to be seen by her subjects traveling alongside the most powerful man in the Roman world, reinforcing her authority through visible association with Rome's foremost general. It is important to understand what this relationship meant, and did not mean, in its historical context. Cleopatra's alliance with Caesar was not simply, or even primarily, a romantic affair in the modern sense. However, much later popular retellings have emphasized that dimension of the story. It was, first and foremost, a political and military alliance that served the interests of both parties. For Cleopatra, Caesar's support meant the survival of her throne against internal rivals, and the backing of Rome's military power in a region increasingly dominated by Roman influence. For Caesar, Egypt represented immense wealth, a secure and grain-rich ally at a critical moment in his own political career back in Rome, and a stable partner in a region of enormous strategic importance to Roman interests in the eastern Mediterranean. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, whom she named Ptolemy Caesar, though he became more widely known by the affectionate nickname Caesarion, meaning roughly Little Caesar. Cleopatra publicly identified the boy as Julius Caesar's son, though Caesar himself, notably, never formally acknowledged this paternity under Roman law, a legal and political ambiguity that would carry serious consequences for both Cleopatra and her son in the years following Caesar's eventual death. Nonetheless, the birth of Caesarion strengthened the practical bond between Egypt and Rome's most powerful figure, and set the stage for the next, even more dramatic chapter of Cleopatra's involvement in Roman political life. Chapter 5: A Queen in Rome. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra traveled to Rome itself, accompanied by her young son Caesarion and her younger brother-husband Ptolemy XIV. This was an extraordinary event by any measure. A foreign monarch, and moreover a woman ruling in her own right, rather than merely as the wife of a king, arriving in the very heart of the Roman Republic, was almost unprecedented, and it generated enormous attention, curiosity, and, among many members of the traditional Roman aristocracy, considerable unease and resentment. Caesar housed Cleopatra in one of his own private villas across the Tiber River from the city center, and their continued relationship, conducted openly during her stay, became a subject of considerable gossip and disapproval among segments of Roman society, particularly since Caesar remained legally married to his Roman wife, Calpurnia, throughout this entire period. Cleopatra's presence in Rome carried significant political weight beyond simple scandal. Caesar had commissioned a golden statue of Cleopatra, portrayed in the guise of the goddess Isis, and had it placed within the Temple of Venus Genetrix, a temple Caesar himself had built to honor the goddess, from whom his own family claimed descent. Positioning a living foreign queen statue inside a temple dedicated to a goddess considered an ancestor of Ceresar's own lineage was an extraordinarily bold statement, blending Cleopatra's identity with both Roman religious tradition and Caesar's personal claims to near-divine ancestry, and it did little to calm the anxieties of Romans already suspicious of Caesar's growing personal power and his apparent fondness for the trappings of monarchy, a form of government the Roman Republic had officially rejected centuries earlier. Cleopatra remained in Rome for an extended period, present in the city during a moment of considerable political tension, as Caesar consolidated an extraordinary degree of personal power, ultimately being declared dictator for an unprecedented 10-year term, and then, in early 44 BCE, dictator for life. Many within the Roman Senate viewed this accumulation of power with genuine alarm, fearing that Caesar intended to abolish the Republic entirely and establish himself as a king in all but name, a fear that Cleopatra's own visible presence in Rome, as a genuine foreign monarch closely associated with Caesar, likely did nothing to ease. This tension reached its violent conclusion on 15th of March, 44 BCE, a date remembered ever since by its Roman name, the Ides of March, when a group of senators, including men Caesar had considered close allies, assassinated him in the Roman Senate, stabbing him more than 20 times. Cleopatra was still in Rome at the time of the assassination, and Caesar's sudden, violent death left her in an immediately precarious and dangerous position, a foreign queen closely tied to a now murdered dictator, stranded in a city suddenly plummet into chaos, uncertainty, and renewed political conflict. Chapter 6. After the Ides of March. Caesar's assassination threw Rome into turmoil, and Cleopatra, recognizing the extreme danger of remaining in a city now hostile to Caesar's memory and associates, departed Rome and returned to Egypt within weeks of his death. Shortly after her return, her young co-ruler and brother husband, Ptolemy XIV, died under circumstances that ancient sources treat with considerable suspicion, with some historians suggesting Cleopatra had him poisoned in order to secure the throne entirely for herself and, crucially, her son. With Ptolemy XIV gone, Cleopatra elevated the young Caesarion to the status of co-ruler beside her, formally presenting him as Julius Caesar's son, and here, a claim of enormous political significance, the power struggle now unfolding back in Rome over who would ultimately inherit Caesar's authority and legacy. That power struggle in Rome eventually resolved into a three-way alliance known as the Second Triumvirate, formed between Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir under Roman law and posthumous political successor, Mark Antony, one of Caesar's most trusted and capable generals, and Lepidus, a senior Roman statesman whose influence would fade relatively quickly compared to his two more ambitious partners. This triumvirate divided control of Roman territory between them, with Mark Antony taking responsibility for the wealthy and strategically vital eastern provinces of the Roman world, a region that inevitably brought him into direct contact, and eventually deep entanglement, with Cleopatra and the Kingdom of Egypt. In 41 BCE, Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at the city of Tarsus, in the region of modern-day southern Turkey, intending to question her regarding Egypt's role, or perceived lack of sufficient support, during the recent civil war that had followed Caesar's assassination. Cleopatra's response to this summons became, in later retellings, one of the most famous entrances in ancient history. Rather than arriving as a supplicant seeking Antony's favor, she arrived by river barge with elaborate and deliberate spectacle, staging her arrival to project wealth, confidence, and divine association, presenting herself in a manner clearly calculated to overwhelm and impress rather than to apologize or explain herself. Whatever precisely occurred during that meeting, its outcome was clear and immediate. Rather than punishing Cleopatra for any perceived disloyalty, Mark Antony instead began a political and personal partnership with her that would ultimately reshape the entire course of Roman history. Carry Cleopatra's story toward its final, dramatic chapters. Chapter 7: Alexandria Reimagined. Following their meeting at Tarsus, Mark Antony traveled to Alexandria to spend the winter of 41 to 40 BCE with Cleopatra, a period ancient sources describe in vivid and often exaggerated detail. Antony and Cleopatra reportedly formed an exclusive social circle among their closest companions, sometimes referred to in ancient accounts by a Greek phrase meaning something like the inimitable livers, a group dedicated to extravagant dinners, elaborate entertainment, and displays of wealth, designed partly for genuine enjoyment and partly, as with so much else in Cleopatra's public life, as a deliberate performance of royal magnificence intended to reinforce Egypt's status and her own authority as its ruler. One frequently repeated story, recorded by the ancient historian Pliny, the Elder writing more than a century later, claims that Cleopatra once wagered Antony that she could spend an enormous sum on a single dinner, and won the bet by dissolving an extremely valuable pearl earring in a cup of vinegar and drinking it. Modern historians treat this particular anecdote with considerable skepticism, both because vinegar realistically could not dissolve a pearl quickly enough for such a dramatic gesture, And because the story fits so neatly into a broader ancient Roman literary tradition of portraying Cleopatra as dangerously extravagant and manipulative, a tradition shaped heavily by later Roman political propaganda rather than neutral historical record. The story nonetheless illustrates, if not through literal fact then through reputation, how thoroughly Cleopatra's image became entangled with ideas of excess and seduction in the centuries following her death. During this period together, Cleopatra became pregnant, and in 40 BCE she gave birth to twins, a son and a daughter, whom she named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, names invoking the sun and the moon respectively, a clear and deliberate statement of cosmic and royal significance rather than a simple personal choice. Shortly after the twins' birth, however, Antony returned to Roman territory, called back by urgent political and military matters, including tension with his fellow triumvir Octavian that required careful management, and for several years afterward, Antony and Cleopatra's relationship existed at a distance, conducted through political maneuvering rather than direct contact. During this separation, Antony married Octavia, the sister of Octavian, a union arranged explicitly to help repair strained relations between the two triumvirs and stabilize the fragile political alliance holding Roman territory together. This marriage placed Cleopatra in a genuinely difficult position, since Antony now had an official Roman wife with strong political connections of her own, even as his personal and political relationship with Cleopatra remained unresolved. It would be several more years before Antony returned decisively to Cleopatra and to Egypt, but when he eventually did, in the late 30s BCE, the reunion proved permanent, setting Rome inexorably on a path toward its final, devastating civil war. Chapter 8: The Donations and the War of Words. By 37 BCE, Mark Antony had returned to the eastern Mediterranean and resumed his relationship with Cleopatra, this time on a far more permanent and politically consequential basis. Antony began spending increasing amounts of time in Alexandria rather than in Roman territory, effectively governing Rome's eastern provinces from Cleopatra's court, an arrangement that provided him with access to Egypt's substantial wealth and resources to fund his military campaigns, particularly a large and ultimately unsuccessful invasion of Parthia, a powerful kingdom to the east that had long troubled Roman ambitions in the region. In 34 BCE, following a partially successful campaign against Armenia, Antony staged a ceremony in Alexandria that would become one of the most politically damaging events of his career, at least in the eyes of Rome. In what became known as the Donations of Alexandria, Antony formally distributed vast territories of the eastern Mediterranean, land that was technically under Roman authority, among Cleopatra and her children, declaring Cleopatra Queen of Kings, elevating Caesarion as her co-ruler and explicitly naming him the true son and heir of Julius Caesar, and granting substantial territories to Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and a younger son named Ptolemy Philadelphus, born to Antony and Cleopatra in the years following their reunion. News of this ceremony, when it reached Rome, provided Octavian with an extraordinarily powerful piece of political ammunition. Octavian argued that Antony had essentially abandoned Roman interests and Roman identity itself in favor of a foreign queen, distributing Roman territory as though were Cleopatra's personal property to grant to her own children, one of whom, Caesarion, represented a direct and dangerous rival, claimed to Octavian's own carefully constructed position as Julius Caesar's sole legitimate heir. Octavian launched an intense propaganda campaign portraying Antony not as a respected Roman general acting within legitimate political authority, but as a man who had been dangerously seduced and controlled by a foreign woman, a narrative that drew on deep-seated Roman anxieties about Eastern luxury, female authority, and the corruption of proper Roman masculine virtue. This propaganda campaign proved remarkably effective and remarkably durable, shaping how Cleopatra would be remembered for the next 2,000 years, far more than any factual account of her actual governance or political skill. Roman poets writing under Octavian's later rule as Emperor Augustus described Cleopatra using language emphasizing supposed foreign decadence, sexual manipulation, and dangerous, almost monstrous ambition, imagery that later European art, literature, and popular culture would absorb and repeat for centuries afterward, until the distinction between Cleopatra the historical ruler and Cleopatra the Roman political caricature became almost impossible for later generations to fully untangle. Chapter 9: The Road to Actium. By 32 BCE, the fragile political arrangement holding the Roman world together had completely collapsed. Antony formally divorced Octavia, severing his last direct family connection to Octavian and removing any remaining pretense of cooperation between the two men. Octavian, for his part, took an extraordinary and legally questionable step, obtaining and publicly reading Antony's will before the Roman Senate. A will that reportedly confirmed Antony's intention. He buried in Alexandria alongside Cleopatra rather than in Rome, and which appeared to confirm his recognition of Caesarion's claim as Caesar's true son, further inflaming Roman anger and suspicion toward Antony's now thoroughly Egyptian-oriented loyalties. Rather than declaring war directly against Antony, a fellow Roman citizen and former ally, which risked appearing as yet another destructive Roman civil war of the kind that had already plagued the Republic for decades, Octavian made a shrewd political decision. He declared war specifically against Cleopatra, framing the coming conflict as a defensive war fought by Rome against a dangerous foreign queen who had corrupted a Roman general and threatened Roman interests throughout the eastern Mediterranean. This framing allowed Octavian to present himself as a patriotic defender of Roman values, rather than as one side of an internal power struggle, a political framing so successful that it continues to shape popular understanding of this conflict, even today. Antony and Cleopatra, in response, began assembling a substantial military force, combining Antony's considerable Roman military experience and remaining loyal legions with Egypt's formidable financial resources and naval capability. Cleopatra herself took an active and direct role in this military buildup, personally contributing ships, funding, and supplies from Egypt's treasury, and according to several ancient sources, insisting on being present with the fleet during the coming campaign rather than remaining safely in Alexandria, a decision some of Antony's own Roman officers reportedly viewed with unease, uncomfortable with the idea of a foreign queen holding such direct influence over what they considered a fundamentally Roman military endeavor. The two sides' forces eventually converged near the western coast of Greece, close to a promontory called Actium, where Octavian's fleet, commanded by his highly capable Admiral Marcus Agrippa, positioned itself to block and eventually confront the combined naval forces of Antony and Cleopatra. By the late summer of 31 BCE, after months of maneuvering, blockade, and increasing strain on Antony's forces, both sides prepared for what would become one of the most consequential naval battles in the entire history of the ancient Mediterranean world, a battle whose outcome would determine not only Cleopatra's fate, but the future political structure of Rome itself for centuries to come. Chapter 10: Defeat and Retreat. The Battle of Actium took place on the 2nd of September, 31 BCE, and unfolded very differently than Antony and Cleopatra had likely hoped. Octavian's fleet, smaller in overall size but faster, better maintained, and commanded with considerable skill by Agrippa, gradually gained the upper hand as the battle progressed, exploiting weaknesses in Antony's larger, but more cumbersome ships and using superior tactical positioning to disrupt the coordination of the combined Egyptian and Roman fleet. Antony's forces had already been weakened by disease and desertion during the preceding blockade, further eroding what advantages his larger ships might otherwise have provided. At a critical point during the battle, Cleopatra's squadron of ships, positioned toward the rear of the combined fleet, broke away and sailed south, away from the fighting, toward Egypt. Antony, upon seeing Cleopatra's ships withdrawing, reportedly abandoned his own flagship and the ongoing battle to follow her, transferring to a smaller vessel in order to catch up with her fleet, leaving the remainder of his forces to continue fighting without him. This moment has generated enormous historical debate and speculation ever since. Ancient sources hostile to Cleopatra, writing under the influence of Octavian's propaganda, portrayed her withdrawal as an act of cowardice or even calculated betrayal, abandoning Antony in the heat of battle. Modern historians offer more measured interpretations, suggesting the withdrawal may have reflected a planned tactical retreat, intended to preserve Egypt's treasury and naval resources for continued resistance, or simply a recognition that the battle was already lost and further losses would serve no purpose, though the truth of Cleopatra's precise intentions during those chaotic moments can never be established with complete certainty from the surviving evidence. Whatever the reasoning behind it, the outcome of the withdrawal was catastrophic for Antony's cause. With their combined leadership having left the battle, the remainder of Antony's fleet and land forces largely surrendered or defected to Octavian in the following days, leaving Antony and Cleopatra with only a fraction of their original military strength as they made their way back to Egypt. The defeat at Actium effectively ended any realistic hope of military victory against Octavian, and both Antony and Cleopatra understood, upon their return to Alexandria, that Octavian's forces would eventually follow them there, bringing the final confrontation of this long conflict directly to Egyptian soil and to the very heart of Cleopatra's kingdom. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to leave a comment and subscribe.